Thanks, Dorothy, for your kind introduction, and thanks for sharing your Tuesday night. I know Tuesday is the most exciting night of the week, usually, so thanks for being here with us. We, as Dorothy already mentioned, this is one of the important things we try and do on campus whenever we can to kind of open up our doors, and I know for me it feels quite often like sharing some of that kind of half-baked ideas I have floating around, but that's just kind of part of what it means to be a reader and scholar of text, and just conversing about our ideas and bouncing them off of you. So thanks for being willing to kind of enter into that with us for this evening. Just to keep us going at a good time, I'll dive in right here and get started. So I'll be talking a bit about apocalyptic outlooks on history on what is now a dreary Tuesday night is perhaps a fitting tone and topic. But as this title suggests, what I want to do tonight is really look at a cross-section of apocalyptic writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls. As I was thinking about this, and I was expecting at least one of my colleagues and friends to lay some groundwork, so I'm so glad that Kip did. I can kind of fast forward over the general introduction to these texts and the world of Qumran. But I would like to start this journey in what might seem like an odd place by looking at the archaeology of Qumran, which is something he didn't get at. So I'd like to start there if we could. And I want to do that by sharing with you a resource I quite like, but I did not produce. We're going to watch here for a few minutes, and I'll just talk over the footage. Is an aerial drone tour produced by Amir Aloni of the Judean desert and the shores of the Dead Sea Scroll, or the Dead Sea, where the scrolls were found in many natural caves, as you're seeing on the screen. You'll also see several flyovers of the site of Qumran, which you've heard a little bit about already this evening. This site that was home to this group of scribes who either penned or preserved these texts and then tucked them away in the caves, these texts that we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. I won't get into debates here about the archaeology of whether this group that lived there was celibate or not, or when they lived there, if it was the 2nd century, the 1st century, or the function of many of the items on the site that you're seeing right now, for example, like these stepped baths for purity purposes. The topic of archaeology in Qumran is very complex and important. I wanted to simply point out the one incontrovertible truth of the archaeology of Qumran. Everybody agrees on this, that the site was reduced to rubble by the Romans in the year 68 CE. Forget about all the debates of what happened before that. Everybody agrees that the site that was inhabited by this group of Jewish scribes came to a bloody and unfortunate end as the Romans were seemingly pursuing a group of Jewish revolt brigands down to the site of Masada. And the site of Qumran, even if you go to Masada today, is right on the highway. And this group seems to have been quite literally caught in the crosshairs. So what I'd like to suggest to you here is what we're looking at, of course, is an archaeological site, but I want to just imagine that we could also think of this as really an apocalyptic wasteland. If you look at this site, it's now in rubble, not only because it's 2,000 years old, but because it was reduced to rubble by the Romans. There's a notable layer of ash that shows that parts of the settlement were burnt to the ground, as well as important evidence of tri-barbed, 3-barbed arrowheads in 1st century Roman style to show that this was the site of a battle, and it didn't end well for the group that we call the Qumranites. Now, I want to use this idea of this being an apocalyptic wasteland for a few reasons. And some of that we've heard a bit already tonight. Dorothy alluded to this text called the War Scroll, as did Kip earlier on, and I think in the first or second slide. This group at Qumran had many texts in their library and many different ideas about the past, the present, and the future of the world around them. But one of the ideas that seemed to be an important one, at least as we find in the War Scroll, is this understanding that this group that lived there was expecting the end, that they were expecting what we might call in a modern sense the apocalypse, of a sort of cataclysmic battle with the powers that be, particularly with the Romans that were overseeing them in Judea at this time. I have just one excerpt of the text here that I'll share with you to kind of illustrate some of those ideas. Here's an excerpt from the War Scroll that reads as follows. And when the banners of the infantry caused their hearts to melt Then the might of God will strengthen the hearts of the sons of light. That was this group referring to themselves. And in the seventh lot, the great hand of God shall overcome Belial, and all the angels of his dominion and all the men of his forces shall be destroyed forever. Now that's an excerpt. It sounds kind of cryptic, and the text is hard to understand on its own. I was trying to think of a way of describing this to us as a modern audience. I know that we're all still heartbroken about how our last few runs at the playoffs have gone for the Canucks. It's a soft spot, but you're aware that it's the NHL playoffs right now? Yes. We're all too aware. I don't know about you, the best games, best series go to Game 7, right? Where you've got a tight kind of 3-3 battle, and then Game 7 you have this epic nail-biting conclusion where your team wins, and unfortunately it's not the Canucks, it might be the Oilers, which is even more difficult. But the idea is that you have this round 7 battle, or this series, where eventually one team wins because they win 4-3. As you read through the War Scroll, that's essentially what happens. You have these stages of battles. It ends up being 3-3. And then at the end, the God of Israel breaks in, and the battle is won on behalf of these sons of light. We hear about that in the War Scroll, which is a very important text for illustrating that outlook that this group had on their religious, political world around them. Now, I want to set that scene in the archaeology as well as in the ideology of this group, because I wanted to do so as a reminder that we can think of the archaeology and these texts in very real terms of human experience, which I think is part of the topic, or part of the idea of this evening tonight. Because for me, where really the theological rubber meets the road, if we can put it in those terms, is when our ideas about the divine, about God, impacts and intersects with our own human experience. Now, I really think that was true, and that would be the case in the historical scene we just described and the site we just saw. And it invites, at least for me, invites us into reflecting about the impact of apocalyptic theologies, plural, then and now, because this is still a very current topic, especially in North American evangelical Christianity. And I want to get at this in just one small way, perhaps as more of a conversation starter than anything, by using this imaginative question. If we put ourselves in the shoes of this group near 68, and the Romans are coming over the hills towards you, what's going through your mind? Are you thinking this is Game 7? Are you thinking that this is the War Scroll and it's going to happen the way that we hope it's going to happen? Or are there other ideas that are going through your mind? And what happens when Game 7 doesn't happen and the Romans roll over your community and you're either pursued away or caught in the crosshairs? We all have outlooks of the future, but as we all know, when real experience in different areas of life hits us, those outlooks adapt and change, and we ask some very difficult and real questions. So I wanted to use that introduction and those questions as a way forward, full well knowing that we won't be able to get at everything we might like around a topic like this, or at least I might like in the few minutes provided. But I do want to try and get at that by doing getting a few snapshots or a cross-section of some of those answers to that imaginative question, what could they have been thinking when this was happening? Because the reality is the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we heard earlier in the evening, is not just one scroll. There's upwards of 1,000 scrolls. It's a library, and like any library, there's diversity in that library with different ideas on offer. One of the places I've been spending a lot of my own research for the past few years, and will continue to until I'm either too bored or too dense to figure it out, is in these Aramaic texts at Qumran. The Library of Qumran was written predominantly in Hebrew, but about 10%, upwards of maybe 13%, depending on how you run the numbers, were actually written in Aramaic. Now, Aramaic was a common language of the Near East, but these were Jewish scribes rewriting, retelling, interpreting, theologizing over their scriptural traditions in Aramaic. What I like about these writings is that not only are they a manageable sliver of this larger pie that we find at Qumran, they're almost certainly coming from times before and places beyond this Qumran community. So they give us a very small but important window into what other thought patterns, theological ideas, cultural items were perhaps circulating in this time leading up to and just after the Common Era. So they're a small window into broader Jewish thought, culture, and practice. And if we have that window through Qumran, then perhaps we're able to learn something more about texts that we already know and read, for most of us in the room today, biblical texts. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to kind of wander through just a handful of these Aramaic texts, share with you some of my half-formed ideas, and hopefully have some time for conversation after if the time permits. And I want to look at 3 topics, and I'll try to link them into texts that we're probably all familiar with as we go through each of the topics. The first one I want to think about is this idea of a new Jerusalem at some sort of future time. And this is something we'll try to hook into, like the book of Revelation. We're probably familiar with that idea there, or the book of Ezekiel. Then the second idea I want to think about is how is it that certain biblical books and books in the scrolls ordered and patterned history? And the place we'll probably go for that is somewhere like in the book of Daniel. We'll maybe hook in there. And then finally, we'll consider the last item, how do we consider moments of catastrophe, like the flood in Genesis, as providing a way for patterning the future? And I want to suggest that these might be some of the diversity of apocalyptic ideas about history in the future that maybe some of those Jews at Qumran in that moment entertained. And if not them, definitely others in ancient Jewish culture at the time. So why don't we get moving through these? We've heard a bit about archaeology. We've got up and running with the Aramaic scrolls. Now we've got our roadmap for these 3 topics. Let's get into it. So let's start here with this idea of a new Jerusalem. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, as I imagine for most of us, when we hear New Jerusalem, we might come to mind is Revelation chapter 21. This is where we have John has this apocalyptic vision, and a very important part of that apocalyptic vision is a new heaven, a new earth, and a new Jerusalem that descends from on high. And you can see that here reflected in what's a very beautiful 14th century tapestry of someone kind of trying to reflect on what that looks like. For readers of the Bible as well, that idea of a new Jerusalem perhaps also brings to mind certain items from the book of Ezekiel. And we see that, again, in another vintage kind of portrayal of a new Jerusalem. Here coming from Ezekiel chapter 48, where in that portrayal of the new Jerusalem, we have things like named gates, as well as a figure that goes along with Ezekiel and measures and gives a blueprint of this eschatological apocalyptic city. Now, one thing that I think is so important for us in the scrolls is how they provide us space, a new space for reconsidering old texts, which I think is something that is a way that we can get fresh eyes for reading the Bible. At times, I've heard, or I still hear, the era between the Old Testament, like Ezekiel, and the New Testament, like the books of Revelation, called the so-called years of silence, which makes really a tacit assumption that the God of Israel had nothing to say to people in this era, or they were simply too deaf to hear him. What I want to suggest to you tonight as we kind of walk through this is that the scrolls, if anything, show us that this period was very loud, and maybe it's something that we're hearing perhaps for the first time in several centuries. So how is it we hear the scrolls and then can approach books like Ezekiel or Revelation differently, and how do we understand the development of ideas between those periods to understand how that New Jerusalem ends up being this New Jerusalem, what happened in between. We'll look at this idea in a few new texts. This idea of a New Jerusalem, if we could look at one writing, or 2 writings that were found at Qumran to do this, to at least illustrate a few points. Now, if you were dealing with this new collection of scrolls in the late 40s, early 50s, and you were sifting through these manuscripts, and you had to decide what to call text, and you came up with a whole bunch of texts that described the New Jerusalem, what would you call it? Perhaps the New Jerusalem Scroll. Seems like a fitting title, doesn't it? One of the texts we're going to look at is in fact called the New Jerusalem, simply because, much like the book of Ezekiel, it's a vision where the seer journeys through this eschatological city, and the seer measures it, shows the temple, and describes certain things about it. There's a whole lot more going on in the text, but I want to just zero in on 3 things. The first thing that we see in this New Jerusalem, this New Jerusalem text in Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that not unlike what we see in the book of Revelation, the city is massive. It's ornate, it's well decorated, And if we were to compare the list we find in the book of Revelation with a number of other ancient Jewish texts that include visions of a New Jerusalem, we'd see some surprising similarities. I've just highlighted a few of those for us here. The text I've got titled NJ is our New Jerusalem, and Tobit is the book of Tobit from the Apocrypha, which might not be familiar for many of us, but Tobit was also written in Aramaic and also discovered at Qumran, and also had a view of the New Jerusalem in the very second to last chapter of the book. As you can see here, even from the list of materials, Tobit and New Jerusalem are describing the same types of things. There's city gates, there's walls to the city, there's streets, there's towers. Some of those items also show up in the book of Revelation. As you can see also, it's a very ornate description of these things. These aren't just made out of brick and mortar, they're made out of costly jewels and gold. At times, these two texts are very close, particularly when we compare the Aramaic material from the Dead Sea Scrolls. My personal favorite is this one that I've included down here. In the Aramaic Tobit at Qumran, we learned a brand new reading where the towers were said to be made not just of gold, but gold-plated wood, as well as in gold-plated wood in this New Jerusalem. So apparently this is more of an economical version. The gold towers would be too costly, your condo fees would be too high in the New Jerusalem, so you better do the gold-plated wood. But it's little details like that that do uncover this conversation, where we can start to see not necessarily connections or influence, but a broader set of ideas that are circulating around portrayals of these New Jerusalem ideas. So perhaps that's one place we could look and see some similarities, or at least echoes of what we find later on in the book of Revelation. The second item that intrigues me in this Aramaic New Jerusalem text is that as the seer tours through the city, he's shown many things, and many things are measured, but one of the things he's shown are large expanses of urban housing, apparently to accommodate thousands of inhabitants. In the vision, these streets are empty, the houses are empty. It's actually somewhat of an eerie read as you read through the text. But the question remains, what would be the function of this domestic housing in an eschatological Jerusalem? Do you have any thoughts? Why would you have this city that's massive and empty with all sorts of dwellings? Perhaps because everybody's going to be coming back. As you read through prophetic books in the Old Testament and early apocalypses, a common idea is that when the divine rule of God comes, the tribes will be ingathered. That could be why we have this massive cityscape with housings to accommodate the diaspora when they come back home in the eschaton. Another idea that perhaps is there that we find in certain other prophetic books and apocalyptic texts is that in the end of the age, there's this idea that this New Jerusalem will be so massive, so epic, so ornate, that it will attract the worship of all the nations. Maybe this housing is meant to accommodate for that. We don't really know exactly, but those are some of the ideas that we see circulating around this idea of apocalypse and the development of history towards an end. Well, perhaps that end of history involves all people, but certainly would involve the tribes of Israel. All right, the last point here for our New Jerusalem, and I'll cue one short clip here again with no sound. What you're looking at here is a large-scale model of what Jerusalem would have looked like in more or less in New Testament times. You'll find this outside of the Israel Museum. It was actually donated by a hotel. It was sitting out front of the hotel, and they didn't want any more. They gave it to the museum. I'd love to go to a hotel that had that out front. I'd even give up the free Wi-Fi if I could go to a hotel. But this is the second temple. This is the temple that was started to be rebuilt in Ezra and Nehemiah's day. It's eventually renovated even by Herod. So it's this huge, massive temple. So when you think of Jesus and the early Christians and early Jews worshiping, teaching, just gathering, it's in these areas, and this is where sacrifice would have happened even down to that period. What intrigues me about this New Jerusalem text is it's written at a time when this temple is still standing down the road. It's still functioning down the road, and there's still a priesthood down the road doing the real job of sacrifice and hosting festivals and worship. Yet as part of this vision, this seer not only beholds this New Jerusalem and these crazy townhouses for the apocalypse or whatever the case is, they also behold a temple in the city of Jerusalem. Not only that, when this seer describes the temple, what he sees is a vivid and live and real functioning cult of priests conducting sacrifices. For me, that's very much an interesting idea and an open question. I don't have a great answer for what the significance is of that sacrifice. Part of it, I think it has to do with how they're interpreting sacrifice by describing what they're seeing. But there seems to be perhaps also a rhetoric here about what it means that a text could be produced that is envisioning a new temple while the old temple is still standing down the block. So when we think of New Jerusalem, our minds might go to Ezekiel, they might go to Revelation, and those are really important conversation partners for understanding this idea in antiquity. But there's also a number of other texts, like this text, that have new things in them that we don't see in those other materials, as well as some fresh ideas and fresh topics that we haven't perhaps seen before. So what was one idea that could have been flashing before people's eyes as they saw the Romans coming down the highway? Well, maybe it's not about Game 7 in the War Scroll. Maybe this is what's going to usher in a new Jerusalem and a new temple and a new cult and a new place to call home. Perhaps, we'll never know, but that's one idea. So why don't we move on to this second item that we could look at. This one might be more familiar from if any of you were at our event last year. This is the time of the academic year where professors just recycle their old lecture notes because we're kind of tired and we're sick of marking. So this might be a bit of deja vu for you, but I won't go into it as much detail as I did last year. But one of the ideas that we see in a number of texts in Aramaic at Qumran is this idea that history works off of cycles and patterns. Now, if you read through the book of Daniel, you'll notice that Daniel keeps having dreams, Nebuchadnezzar keeps having dreams, and a real strong and prevalent motif is they have to do with 4 kingdoms. First this one, then the next one, 3, 4, and then the kingdom of God is coming right around the corner. Now, the theologies we hear in Daniel and see in Daniel and other texts that play off of that idea, to a certain degree the book of Revelation as well, are very much critical of empire. They're very much arising out of moments of crisis or oppression where there's a hope and an anticipation that finally God is going to break through history and we'll experience the kingdom of God. We'll be freed from the yoke of the empires they've been suffering under. The term I want to use there to describe that is this one, apocalyptic historiography. And what I mean by that is simply how is it these writers of these early apocalypses are looking at where they've been in the past, understanding where they are in the future, in the present, and then trying to look ahead to the future and see how everything orders and fits. They're telling a story, they're writing a history, but it's apocalyptic in the sense that it's moving towards a definite endpoint. I have 2 examples here from different texts I thought we could look at. Here's another clever modern title. So let's say you discover these scrolls again, you're sifting through them. You find a text that, like Daniel, is describing a vision where 4 kingdoms are rolling one after the next. Now, what would you call that text? The 4 kingdoms, all right? You should all sign up for a grad program after this. This is not that difficult. It's actually clever name. 4 kingdoms, New Jerusalem. You see how this works. Now, this text, you could probably guess by now, is a vision. It's apocalyptic. It involves the overturning of 4 kingdoms. Different symbolism is used than in Daniel, but the same idea is there. Now, of the many things we could talk about, and I mentioned this about a year ago at our last public lecture, many things we can talk about in this text, what strikes me as the most interesting one is not that they're reusing this 4-kingdom scheme. We knew of all sorts of authors in early Jewish and classical writings that did this already, but the way that the scheme is used, perhaps under a new imperial context. And again, this is something that you'll find different explanations of, but I'm sharing with you what I feel is the most compelling one. It just so happens to be one that I agree with, so it's funny how that works. But what I think we see happen in the 4 kingdoms text is if you look back at Daniel, you see Daniel is running kingdoms this way. He says, well, perhaps there's going to be Babylon. Everybody knew that. Okay, then Media, which kind of comes, and then Persia, and then Greece, and then right around the corner, the rule of God is going to come. That's more or less what's going on in Daniel's visions and Nebuchadnezzar's visions in Daniel 2, 4, and 7. But what happens when the rule of God doesn't come? When the Greeks end up being taken over, essentially, at least losing this territory to the Romans. Then what do? What does your apocalyptic scenario have to do? What does that historiography have to do? It has to evolve, it has to adapt, it has to be updated. One of the real beautiful things about apocalyptic literature is that it's always being updated, it seems. Even down into modern day movements, quite often will do this sort of thing. What Four Kingdoms does, I think, is just that. It says, well, the first kingdom is going to be a hybrid kingdom. It's going to be Babylon, Persia, these two super powers in the east. And then it says Greece will come. And then it has to deal the hard truth that we know the kingdom of God didn't come. The Romans came. But then the kingdom of God is going to come. So what you see happening here is this idea that apocalypses are updated and they can accommodate new geopolitical circumstances like a new empire. The Four Kingdoms is one way of doing that, and it's a way of communicating a sense of hope to a reader to say, God still got this. There's still an architect of history. Things are still progressing along a certain plan. Just sit tight and have hope because the kingdom of God is back on the horizon. That's one thing we see happen in Daniel as well as in Four Kingdoms. One other mechanism of apocalyptic historiography I want to share with you is in another writing from the book of 1 Enoch. Now, many of us will know 1 Enoch if you've taken classes here. Typically put in the pseudepigrapha. It's a writing about dreams and visions and apocalypses associated with this figure of Enoch, who's really kind of enigmatic in Genesis 5. He just kind of disappears. God takes him. Well, there's a whole story that develops around that in ancient Judaism. And one of the stories that develops around that involves Enoch having a vision of history and how it rolls out. Only for Enoch, in what we call the Apocalypse of Weeks, it's not 4 kingdoms, it's 10 weeks. 10 weeks are 10 periods of history. And as you follow that story, you can see that, again, history is structured. Those weeks are meant to convey that there's a pattern and order and an architect of history, and it provides the reader, hearer, audience, whoever, with hope that these events are going to happen because they're happening according to a pattern. Along with that, what we see happen in the book of Enoch is this is not just about giving hope and encouragement because there's a pattern to history and God's writing the whole play, so don't worry about it. There's a few other mechanisms for claiming authority for this historiographical mechanism in the book of Enoch. I just want to share one of them with you here. It's a very important one for this book because several times in 1 Enoch, particularly in the Apocalypse of Weeks, Enoch says, I know this is true not simply because I had a dream, but because I read it myself in heavenly tablets or books. You see that here in 1 Enoch 93, and the brackets are translating parts of the Aramaic text of Qumran that's not available, but the text says something like this. Enoch says at the end, I myself, Enoch, this figure from Genesis, I was shown everything in a vision of heaven, and from the words of the watchers and holy ones, that's the angels, I know everything. Okay. I would have just stopped right there. But he goes on and says, and in the tablets of heaven I read and understand everything. Kind of a clever thing to include in there. If you're sending a message to a community about hope in the face of adversity, about perhaps political issues under empire, you've got this figure from the ancient Israelite past saying, I went up to heaven, I read how things are going to happen, just trust me because I'm already an authoritative patriarch. Oh, and by the way, it was whispered in my ear from the angels. These are some of the ways that we see apocalyptic writers trying to explain the past as well as how they look towards the future. So our first idea that we touched on was New Jerusalem. How did that maybe help us recontextualize things like Revelation, Ezekiel, as well as patterns of history like in Enoch or in Four Kingdoms? How does that kind of get around that idea of what's happening in Daniel? The last item I want to do, or spend a few minutes on with you here, is where we find certain texts that provide what I like to call kind of bookends on history. Here we're going to look at instances of where the flood in Genesis somehow waters the seeds, sows the seeds for an expectation of something in the future that's very much linked to what happens in the very beginning, this idea of the flood. Now, as readers will know, as most of us will know in the room, you read Genesis, it says, in the beginning, and it doesn't take very long for things to go off course. Have you noticed? It goes off course pretty quickly. In fact, by 5-6 chapters in, God is really scratching his head and saying, maybe we need to hit reset and see if we can get a blank slate, a blank canvas, and try this whole thing again. The flood is very much that reset button where the evil is wiped off of the earth, except for one righteous man, Noah, and his family, who then move on into this really second creation. That happens in Genesis 5 and 6. As you read, though, Genesis 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, things are still pretty wicked and evil. It's a bit of an exegetical and theological problem. I thought everything was wiped off the face of the earth. How did it survive? That's a classic question. That's a question that a lot of ancient interpreters and writers reflected on, as Dorothy knows from her book on Noah traditions. This receives a lot of airplay, and it's one that's worth thinking about even now. So we're not going to be able to get at all of those variety of explanations, but I do want to look at just one text that tries to explain what's going on in that situation. The writing I want to look at again is found in Qumran. It was known from some later sources, in particular in Manichaean literature. It's also written in Aramaic, but it tells the story of these Nephilim we hear about in Genesis 6:4. We have the Watchers come down and they mate with human women and they produce these giants that are ravenous and bloodthirsty and violent on the land. Now, if you were to come across a book, all right, see if we can go 3 for 3. It's a book of stories about giants. What would you call it? Book of Giants. All right, we are a sharp group for a Tuesday evening right after exam week. Oh my goodness. The Book of Giants. That's what we're going to look at here. The Book of Giants is something that showed up at Qumran in Aramaic in a handful of manuscripts. In really short form, what it does is it looks at that story in the flood and it says, what about those guys? Maybe they had a story to tell. Maybe we can retell the story and explain some of our loose ends and questions in Genesis. What I've got for you here is just a short or small example of, at times, how we're not dealing with Dead Sea Scrolls, we're dealing with Dead Sea scraps, tiny ones. But the idea here is these are new texts that we didn't know about. How can we even gain glimpses of parts of this larger work, even if we can't know everything? That would be a good example of that in the Book of Giants. Text we had hints of before, now we have a few more glimpses of. Now for the Book of Giants, it's a great read. It's not one I would read right away to my kids before bed, but perhaps soon. But one of the reasons is it's full of nightmares. It's full of nightmares and dreams, as many apocalyptic writings are. In this text, there's a number of giants have dreams. 2 of them in particular, I think, are important ones. 2 brothers, giant brothers in fact, named Haya and Ohaya. They have these foreboding dreams that in some way seem to link the past in the flood and the future judgment that they are expecting in the eschaton. Now, the first giant tells his dream of a forest being tended by gardeners. It's being watered, the trees are growing, everything's fine, and the trees grow very tall and very high. Now, you don't have to do a whole lot of reading in the text to figure out that that's a symbolic dream about angels coming down, watering the earth, and then giants growing up. So this is a dream they're having about themselves. But as the dream goes on, things go from this kind of paradise-type garden to now trees being chopped down, the garden being flooded, and then purged with fire. That's the first dream that happens. And as you read through the text, the giants actually go to Enoch and say, what does this even mean? And it seems like the interpretation they get is that symbolic imagery was meant to communicate their imminent destruction in the flood. That, like the trees, they would be chopped down, their bodies would die. Now, here's an interesting question to think about. What about their spirits? Could their spirits live on through the flood? Could that be an explanation of how evil still arises after the flood? That maybe the giants experienced bodily death, but their spirits lived on to wreak all sorts of terrible things in the post-flood world. What we hear about then is a second dream. A second dream that we see happen in the Book of Giants that involves the other brother, and his dream seems to deal with that problem of continual evil and the resolution of continual evil in the end. If you read through Daniel 7, you find that Daniel has a dream where we have 4 kingdoms coming, and then God, as judge, sits, books are opened, thousands of angels flank him, and judgment is handed down. And that's meant to be like a symbol of eschatological judgment. The same thing, or very similar thing, happens here in the book of Giants. books are opened, judgment is handed down, and the idea, I think, behind that second dream is to provide that beginning and an end, bookends of history, to resolve that question of evil. Okay, the giants died off, their bodies died off in the flood, but how did evil persist thereafter? Well, maybe it's their spirit. Well, were they off the hook? Absolutely not. They're going to be judged in the eschaton in the end. Now, what I like about the book of Giants, even with the few points we've heard about today, or this evening rather, is that it might be a little more difficult for us as modern readers of the Bible to link that into something we're familiar with. It's got this loose affiliation with Genesis, but it's pretty imaginative and pretty bizarre perhaps to us. But what I find there I value most is how texts like the book of Giants allow us to listen in on ancient conversations. You mentioned ancient hermeneutics. How is it ancient people were interpreting scriptural traditions and trying to tie up loose ends? You may have noticed Genesis is kind of a confusing book that from verse 1 invites a whole lot of questions. We're not the first ones to approach it and think that or feel that way. What I love about a text like Giants is that it invites us into that theological reflection and speculation. So that's a bit of a tour through some of the texts I'm thinking of these days. Thanks for hearing some of my thoughts, but if I could maybe just say here's a couple of takeaways for us as you continue to read text, certainly in your course, or if this is the first time reading the scrolls or hear about the scrolls, some of the things to think about as we move forward. The first one I was thinking of as I was preparing for this evening is that we live in a world where apocalyptic speculations are still common and sometimes bizarre. Perhaps these aren't the first or last apocalyptic scenarios we've heard of. Texts like these allow us to hear some of those early speculations, perhaps contextualize some of those later ones, and understand where we're different from them or the same. The final thing I think is important is that these texts also show a diversity, a theological diversity. At times we have a difficult time holding theological diversity together, holding two things in the balance. What I like about Qumran, this library, is it attests to that diversity, and it shows that that's a place of conversation and debate, but I think in many ways that's something we can learn. As we learn to read in the Bible, as well as read around it, perhaps you can learn some of those hermeneutics from them, as well as observing how they dialogue over texts like this. So thanks again for having us here tonight, for hearing some of my thoughts on these new texts. Thank you.